You should all see a request on your screen. So welcome to our webinar today with John Lees, looking at job seeking in a challenging landscape. Never more so has it been important to understand how to make connections remotely and advance your career when there are so many jobs which aren't even advertised these days. We actually did a similar webinar last month with John, and it was incredibly popular, unsurprisingly. There are many people who are in need of his good counsel at the moment. So we're back, and this for this webinar, it's on Zoom. You're all being recorded, and how it's going to work is that we're going to have a presentation from John, and then Q&A led by Eleanor Christie, our executive editor on the professional list for Open University Press. There will be Q&A opportunities, so you can put comments in the chat box, and then if you have any specific questions that you'd like to be put to John, then please can you put those in the Q&A box. There's also a special feature to upvote, so if you have questions that you're seeing which you'd like the answers to, then make sure that you vote for those so that we can get through as many as possible in the time and answer the most popular questions first. So I'm sure John doesn't need much introduction for most of you. He's one of the UK's most prominent career transition coaches, and he has published an incredible number of books on careers and work. And with Open University Press, he's actually worked on 22 titles with us, including revised editions. So we have been very privileged to work with John on most of these projects. And you can find out more about his work on our website. The book that we have in particular focus is, of course, How to Get a Job You Love, which has been published in its 11th edition in August, and reflects many of the new pressures put on job seekers. It's available on our website to order. I've put the link up there if anyone would like to take it down now. But of course, we'll also be putting that in the chat box for people who haven't got a copy yet. This time it also includes a free Career Shifters career change test, which should hopefully be of aid to people who are wondering what is next for them, and they might not be in an industry or career path that they're particularly enamored with. And what's great is that there are so many options, and I'm going to hand it over to John to speak more about this and how you can get a job you love. Once I stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Laura. I'm just going to start the presentation now, and hopefully it's come up on your screens. So this is what we're talking about today. Many of the things I'll be talking about are covered by the range of books, the suite of books that McGraw Hill currently publish with my name on the cover. And we're going to be principally talking about material that appears in the brand new edition of How to Get a Job You Love, which tries to respond to what's going on in the current marketplace. So today, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about first steps into the job market. We're going to be talking about how you might think about controlling your message to get better early results from your activities. We're also going to be thinking about some of the things you might be doing at the moment if you are looking for something new. In other words, you're thinking about a career change, and some tips for getting better results from the exploration that you will need to be doing along with all of these activities, really. So as Laura said, this is being recorded today, so if you miss something, don't worry about it. You can go back and listen to it again. Where should we start? Well, let's start with forced job change, because that's the real focus of today, and maybe the reason that many of you are here on the call with us. And I want to think about the pressure that people feel under when they are required to look for a new job for reasons outside their control. And the first pressure comes from other people. It can come from people who tell you to get out there, start networking like mad, go out and sell yourself, They may even put job ads in front of you. So a client of mine, Sally, she's her recent experience was that friends and family are cutting out job advertisements and putting them in front of her. And the problem is that these are jobs that she was doing about 10 years ago. So they're disappointing to her and kind of depressing. So there is real pressure from other people. So that's my first tip for today, really, is try to work with positive-minded people who listen to your career goals and then help you move towards the things that you're really looking for. What else are we worried about? People who are required to go to the job market in today's rather strange circumstances find that they worry about their transferable skills. They're not quite sure what organizations are looking for. There's a sense of panic, and that's an important thing to register, because if you panic into doing things which are unproductive, you do use some of the energy that you have at the beginning of a job search. And they're very strongly influenced by early feedback and results. And of course, that's magnified. If you're sending out an indifferent CV, you're not quite sure what you're looking for, maybe you're locked into job search methods that are fairly unproductive. So you're not going to get much feedback. You're going to largely hear silence, and that has an immediate and important effect on your confidence. That's a good place to begin, really, which is, the image on screen is somebody sleepwalking. And what I mean by sleepwalking is just going to the marketplace without really thinking about what it is you want to say about yourself. So maybe leading with background information about you, which isn't helpful. Maybe something about your most recent job title or your work history, or the opening words, the first 15 words of your CV may actually point somebody away from the kind of job that you're really looking for. So to give you a concrete example, a client of mine I'm working with at the moment, the first line on her CV profile is modern languages graduate, which is great. But the roles she's applying for have little connection with that world, that academic subject. So the first piece of information she's presenting is true, but not terribly helpful. In fact, in some ways misleading. So it's what she's done is to replace it with a kind of generic job title which describes her role as a marketing professional, because that's what people are looking for. They're looking for information which they can recognize and tie into really easily and really quickly. So this is the stuff that puts you in default mode. What I mean by default mode is every electronic device has a default mode as it comes out of the box. That's the factory settings, if you like. And if you simply put down your work history and your list of qualifications, that's the default mode. People make of it what they make of it. And sometimes you mislead them. Sometimes they don't find the best information about you because it's not on page one. And often you are distracting busy people. Now, the thing about distracting busy people is they'll find something else to look at. So second important tip today is to think about what information you're going to foreground on your LinkedIn profile and in your CV. And ultimately, it will be what you want people to say about you. So that's the last point really on this screen, is to think about how people recommend you, what they say about you, and a lot of that is influenced by you. It's what you tell people when you tell them what you're looking for. We all make rookie mistakes. And interestingly, people make them in every generation. So this isn't just people going to the job market for the first time. People forced back into it. It could include people who've been in the same job for 20 years or more. They tend to make the same initial errors. Now that sounds judgmental to say it's an error, but what I mean by a rookie mistake is a mistake which everyone else makes, something which slows you down, which is unproductive and leads to no feedback. So sending things out to random targets on the basis of numerical conquering, you would just want to send as many applications out as you can. Be careful with that, because silence affects your confidence. The other thing that happens is that your message is vague or flat or wrong. And when I say your message, I mean the principal things that you want your CV to say or your LinkedIn profile to say. If it's vague, it misdirects, sends people in the wrong direction. If it's flat, you sound under-energized, not terribly interested in what you're going to do next. And wrong could simply be that it doesn't relate to the kind of roles and organizations that you're interested in. We all have good contacts, and my recommendation is that you don't use them too soon. You use those contacts when you're pretty clear what you're looking for, and you can ask them for 2 or 3 contacts or 2 or 3 answers to a couple of really focused questions. If you go and see busy senior people when essentially you're saying, I don't really know what I'm looking for yet, and my CV's all over the place, then you'll get sympathy, but you're not going to get the same laser-like focus and help and recommendation that you can get from senior people when you know exactly how you want them to help you. And the last thing is using screens and email to keep your distance. Now, I know that's a strange thing to say in this pandemic world where we're forced to do so much of our work through screens, as we're all doing here today. But it still applies, because if you can reach out to somebody, make it the most human contact you can. So if you can telephone somebody, that's better than emailing. And if you can have a Zoom conversation with somebody, that's a lot better than just a telephone call, and so on. So just the temptation is to try and reach out to people at a long distance through LinkedIn or by email. And my recommendation is you turn every conversation you can into a live conversation where you can see somebody's face and hear somebody's voice, because you build relationships and you get remembered. An email is forgotten in 2 or 3 minutes. A good conversation, people can remember for months. So you do the mathematics. These activities tend to slow most people down. And when I mean using social media creatively, I mean breaking the rules of social media. So LinkedIn is a fantastic research tool. It shows you where people are. It shows you what their experience is. It shows you who they're connected to. But if you try just to connect using LinkedIn, things tend to fall apart. Connections get lost. So if you see somebody you're interested in LinkedIn, find somebody connected to them that you know and pick up the phone. Do it through human relationships. So constantly turning social media from being a resource into a springboard to people-focused activity. And that's why I mean networking of any kind. Coffee mornings on Zoom, any kind of conversation or a connection, checking in with people that you used to work with, people that you studied with, almost anyone where you can have a conversation, which can be about a number of things. It can be about recharging your energy batteries. It can be about trying out certain kind of messages about yourself. It can be fact finding to find out about particular industries and sectors. It can simply be to ask somebody to help you reach out to an important contact. And don't miss out direct approaches. It's the one tool that candidates still sometimes neglect. So what is a direct approach? Well, it means you're pitching directly towards an organization that looks interesting to you. And rather than waiting for that organization to advertise, you send a short, and I really do mean short, email summarizing half a dozen points why your experience is relevant and useful, and asking for a conversation. It's not guaranteed to work, but then nothing's guaranteed to work. You've got to try lots of different channels and lots of different approaches, but don't miss out on the direct approach. If you're thinking about changing career, just be aware that there are certain kinds of classic problems of jumping the fence. And that's often that you've not yet learned to describe your skills in language which a new organization in a new sector understands. I often hear myself saying that employers don't make your skills transferable. You do by translating them. And your skills communicate when you find language which organizations can not only understand, but can get excited about. And for the same reason, learn how to tell your career story in such a way that makes sense. Think of it as a series of turning points and connections and decisions, and get used to saying, I moved on because, I chose this course because, I decided it was time for a change because that sounds like you're in charge. And of course, if you're telling a great career story and the next obvious job sounds like the next chapter in that story, people buy into that. They understand why you're applying. And the other problem around people wanting to make a career change is what I call evidence of commitment. Now, this is important because when people are looking for jobs, they often try things out, or they dip their toes in the water, or they experiment with the idea, they play with the idea of career change, and sometimes talk to people about that, but they're not really committed to it. Ultimately, they're probably going to stay in the sector that they know. Committed career changers do slightly different things. They have lots of conversations. They do lots of research. They reach out to people. They talk to not just one person in a sector, but maybe half a dozen people. So as they move through the chain, if you like, what they're able to do is to say, I've had lots of great conversations, I've talked to lots of people, and I've discovered some amazing things. And that shows an above average level of commitment. And if you want to make a career change, that's where you need to be, in the above average zone. So some of you will be thinking now, well, okay, in a tough job market with lots of people chasing roles, how are you going to stand out? How are you going to do that something extra which gets you shortlisted, which gets an organization to talk to you, that takes you into a process? The first thing is understanding about a focus message about yourself. I said earlier on that CVs are often vague or flat, and it's because the people writing them haven't quite got control of the evidence that they're choosing to present. So interrogate your past. Actually, this makes a great conversation topic. Sit down with somebody in a Zoom coffee conversation. Make sure they've got your CV in front of you, but then talk your colleague through some incidents from your past, projects you've done. Ask yourself, of all the jobs you've ever done, what did you enjoy most? What were you doing? So start to pull out from your past, as a block of raw material, hard evidence. Where have you made a difference? Where have you done anything which you could describe as a success? And how do you demonstrate that? And sometimes it's through numbers or money saved or doing things on target or achieving goals on time. But sometimes it's about winning hearts and minds, developing other people, coaching and mentoring. Sometimes it's about deputizing for your boss, or reaching out to a customer, or providing really high levels of customer satisfaction. You know what these highlights look like because they're often memories that you look back at with some fondness, and yet they often don't jump off the page in people's CVs or work history. So that's what I mean by the so what content. So if you're describing a job that you've done, and all you're doing really is chopping up the job description and explaining to the reader the painfully obvious tasks that you undertook in the role, then that's a kind of so what thing, isn't it? So a client of mine recently was talking about working as a barista in a coffee bar, and the first version of his CV said things like, making and serving coffee. Well, that's the so what statement, isn't it? But then he told me the stories about how he'd built fantastic relationships and brought new ideas into the business and started to do things differently. And of course, that's where the evidence comes out, the really good stuff that is not a so what piece of evidence. It's a quality piece of evidence that gets you noticed. What we're really trying to do is something quite difficult, which is persuading in writing. We're trying to get people to commit to talk to you, and you're not going to be in the room to get them to do that. So that's what a CV does. That's what a LinkedIn profile does. It's what a cover letter or cover email does. It persuades through writing in order to begin a real conversation. It doesn't get you the job. It opens the door. So think about what your best evidence is, the stuff you're most proud of, but the things that are most relevant to the new role and the new organization. And that's why you reach out to people, to find out an awful lot more about what organizations are really looking for. And then you make sure that's in the spotlight. And where do I mean in the spotlight? I mean in the top third of page 1 of your CV, in the top screen of your LinkedIn profile. In other words, the place where people are looking for it, the place where people are going to give maximum attention. And if you want to make a career change, I strongly recommend that you lead in with a profile, a short paragraph, which is not full of cliches saying you're a self-starter, highly motivated, team player. That's what everybody writes. It's focused to say something about your background, what you do, maybe your sector experience, and then it goes on to talk about what you're looking for at the moment, how you want to bring your skills to bear. So that profile is the introduction, is the handover that says, before you read my work history, just be aware of these themes, these overall messages. You're not going to be in the room when your CV is read, so the document has to do the work for you. And if you're thinking about moving on from redundancy, from a layoff situation, and that's something you might be facing now or in the near future, and it's becoming an experience that an awful lot of people are going through this year, here's some things that will help a little bit. First of all, practice talking about what you do well. So a lot of people say, well, I don't really like to talk about myself, and I guess I'll make it up when I get to the interview. That doesn't really work. You've actually got to compress some of this material into short bursts of evidence, and you've got to do it in a way which is authentic for you. So if you don't like praising yourself, you don't like talking about your achievements and your successes, find another way, a more authentic way of doing it. It's by describing the tasks one at a time, or talking about the challenge, talking about your strategy, talking about what you learned from that experience. These are softer and easier ways into it. You need energy, so find exciting people to talk to. Almost anybody will do to start with, because what you're doing is, for example, listening to the way other people made interesting career breakthroughs, how people are job hunting at the moment. You're talking to people who are doing jobs which look exciting and interesting, because that energy transfers to you and it stimulates what you do next. And rather than using social media simply to gather statistical evidence of how popular you are, the number of people following you, use it to connect and create real conversations, voice conversations, face-to-face conversations, even if it's through a new screen. And if you're thinking about using redundancy as a moment where you want to make a career change, then think about how you're going to explore, how you're going to draw maps for yourself about sectors that you know nothing about. We often think that redundancy is always a negative experience, but it's a mixed bag. I've certainly worked with many people who've gone through redundancy, and a lot of them have started by saying, you know, actually there is a positive side to this, because for the first time in my career, I feel I'm in control of the choices that I'm going to make, and I'm going to look at finding the right mix of things to do in a role, and maybe explore completely different sectors and find out what's out there. Great thing about finding out, if you do it through conversations, is that it improves your visibility as well, because people remember you and they make connections when you're not in the room, and they find stuff out and pass it along to you. And so some of this information gathering, fact finding, is what we might think of as an information interview. So in other words, you're not going to somebody to say, how do I get a job in your organization, which is actually quite counterproductive. You're going to them to say, I'd love to find out more about the job you do, the organization, the sector you work in. Fact finding is a really, really powerful tool. Even if you only do a little bit of it, it's fantastically revealing. Be honest about it. Just say, I'm exploring. I'm exploring is the best phrase I can recommend to you, even if you're just thinking about career change, because it takes the pressure off you to name exactly what job you're looking for and exactly what you're going to do next. And you can honestly say, I'm exploring. I'm looking at a range of options. I'm finding out. And when try and have opportunities to talk to people who know about sectors that look attractive and interesting, think of asking, not telling. So in other words, it's not about you talking about yourself, it's about you asking great questions. There's a whole section in the book about this, the reveal method, and scripts that you can use to establish useful, meaningful, authentic conversations with people, get them to just reveal to you what's going on in their world. But keep following your curiosity. Curiosity is a very powerful thing in this process, because it feeds you with energy. And if you don't like talking about yourself, well, the really good news is that there are quieter ways of doing this. I understand that. At least half of the clients I work with will tell me, I hate networking. I don't like selling myself. I don't like talking about my skills. Well, guess what? You really don't have to, because there are other scripts available like this one. Talk about what you enjoy doing, what you've enjoyed studying, what you've enjoyed in your work, in your career, what you enjoy looking at the moment, what fascinates you, what brands and technologies and ideas and types of organization and working models, you name it. What interests you? What have you already found out about? What conversations have you had? And where do you want to go next in your exploration? People respond really warmly to energized curiosity, which is a much better message to take to the marketplace than I don't really know what I'm looking for, or I've applied for jobs and I'm not getting any results. That gets you sympathy, but it doesn't get you remembered. This stuff does. And finally, a couple of things, tips about moving forward as you get into shortlisting processes, because if you get an interview, you want to make the best of it. It's not a rehearsal for the real thing. It's a golden opportunity. So prepare for the employer checklist, and that means interrogating the job, working out what the organization is really looking for. Write down on the left-hand side of a piece of paper what you think are the must-have items of the organization, and on the other side of the piece of paper, write down your matching stories, short stories, and prepare good short stories to sticky questions, awkward questions like, why did you leave that job so early? Or why didn't you finish that qualification? Because if you don't prepare those answers, you are going to get stuck and things are going to unravel. Prepare short stories, be concise, but keep plenty of stories and evidence in reserve, particularly at the end, and have some questions at the end. Questions about the future of the job, not the kind of question that you could have discovered the answer to by spending just 20 seconds on a website. And make your career one story. So coming back to that idea again, because I've worked very closely with a recruiter friend of mine, and he said to me, do you know, John, the candidates I like, the candidates I remember at the end of the day when I'm driving home, are people who are energized, and they often say they're lucky. They're lucky because they're allowed to make a change, or they're going to do something different, and they have a coherent story. So just repeating that idea really, that talk about your whole work history, not as a series of accidents or a kind of a mixed up sequence of events. Think of it as one story, explain the connections, make it connected and credible, bring out the themes. And if you want to make a change, explain why your past makes sense of that. And ultimately, make sure that the job that's on offer sounds like the obvious next chapter in your career story. So we are sort of coming to the end now. You can find out at the end how to connect with us and find out a little bit more about the book that's on offer through the McGraw Hill website. But I'm now going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to open up to any questions that you have for us, which Eleanor will be handling for us.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, John, for such an informative presentation. I feel like you managed to squeeze so much into sort of 30 minutes to 20 minutes. So I think there's going to be a lot to think about. So I'm going to start with some questions that we got in advance of the webinar, but I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A, and I'll also be putting those in as well. So I suppose to sort of start with a point that links to your career story sort of suggestion is, would you recommend being specific about what you want when you're reaching out, or being vague so that you're open to more opportunities and so you can kind of see what's out there?
That's an important question, and the answer is it always depends who you're talking to, really, because if you're talking to a trusted friend and what you're really seeking is encouragement, and you're really taking them an honest problem like, I've got loads of career ideas and I don't know how to prioritize them, then you might find another person who's really helpful to say, well, what can you get more excited about? Where if you can only research half a dozen of these things, what are you going to put at the top of the list? But if you go to a busy executive or a recruitment consultant or somebody that is focused on one particular industry, and you say, I've got hundreds of ideas, then actually that's really counterproductive, because you're saying, I want your help to undo my vagueness. And what you really want from them is, I want to know about your industry. So often what helps when you say I'm exploring, but today I'm really here to find out about what you do. And that's the laser-like focus that works so well, because people are much happier to talk about themselves than they are to discuss your kind of career uncertainty.
Okay, and I think that actually links quite well with a question that's just come in from Lisa, which asks around how people can actually connect with people from different sectors, even if they don't know anyone. And I think that's particularly important when, as you said, you need to move just beyond that screen and actually have those active conversations.
It's vitally important if you want to change career, because it's about mapping, it's about picking up language that organizations use to describe top performers. It's about understanding what goes on underneath the bonnet in a job. It has so many spin-offs. So trying to change career without having conversations with people in new sectors, it's like trying to cook a 4-course meal over a candle flame. It takes forever. So the appropriate shortcut is to get people on your side, to help them to get them to unlock what's going on. And there are lots of different ways of doing it. I mean, you can actually do some of it by email. I often find myself saying, avoid it, but actually you can get some great results. Send you a short, positive, clear emails. Be really clear about what you're looking for. I would like to ask you a couple of questions. Can I have 10 minutes of your time? And that also works well alongside other strategies which say reach out to people through people that you already know. So if you've got a career idea, go and talk to just 3 or 4 people you know really well and ask them the question, who do you know that I should be talking to? And please, will you make an introduction for me? So if you can, you avoid cold calling or cold contact.
Okay. And yeah, I think you're right that sometimes there's those sort of connections that are just one-off that you might not know about, because it's not something that comes up naturally in conversation unless you ask. So another question that's come up is, what advice would you give for those re-entering the job market after a career break, for example, like following maternity leave or maybe after a period of study?
It's an important question, because it also helps people who have perhaps had a lot of time out this year. They've been furloughed and then laid off. So they haven't actually been holding a job down for some months. So it's the same issue applies. And in a way, that also takes a lot of pressure off, because employers are more used to looking at candidates now who perhaps haven't been in a job for a little while. So my first suggestion would be, don't draw a lot of attention to it, but prepare for sticky questions. So a sticky question is, what have you been doing? What have you been learning? What have you been looking at? How are you different now from the way you were 12 months ago? So, and even if your learning is relatively recent and you've spent a lot of time recently improving your skills, doing some online courses, familiarizing yourself with sectoral needs and what industries are doing, then that's okay, because it's what they're hearing most is not fact, but energy. So if you say, I'm looking after my learning, I'm really focused on this, I've had some great conversations, it's a really different message to somebody that says, well, I've been out of a job, I haven't been doing anything.
And I suppose that's a sort of particularly important to rethink how your CV looks and the message that it gives through that. Maybe you last updated it when you're in your previous job before this break. And so we've actually got some questions coming in the chat. So let me just read them. And yeah, do you have any views about plain formatted CVs versus richer formatted ones with images, or sort of, I guess, maybe some more unusual kind of formatting?
You tend to start with what the organization wants and expects, and that's quite a good rule. So if somebody wants a fairly conventional CV that doesn't have lots of special effects in it, and you send them something which has lots of visual effects on it, in a way you're starting to sort of become distracted from their rules, and you're taking people's attention away from the message you want to get across. There are some sectors, graphic design is an obvious example, where clearly you've got to do something visual and impressive. There are some sectors where you do need a video pitch. There are some sectors where they'd expect to see a well-developed LinkedIn profile with some embedded material and examples of work and videos and all kinds of links on it. But it's very much driven by the market that you're going into, which is another good reason for talking to people who work in the sector. So, you know, because a great question could be, what are organizations looking for and how do they want to see it? However, I mean, the good news is, in my experience, that a CV really confirms something an organization knows about you already. Now, what I mean by that is they've heard about you, you've been recommended, they've come across you maybe on social media. So in other words, it's not the door opener you think it is, it just confirms an initial impression. And if that's the case, then as long as it's clear, focused, and it's got the right information at the front end, it will probably work for you.
As you said, you know, your CV needs to do the speaking for you when they're reading it. You're not going to be in the room, but they'll have all that other information around. So we've actually got another question around CVs from Lee, and he says, how do you keep your CV achievements short? It's got years of experience, and sort of how do you make sure that you match the job description, but capturing everything?
Okay, yeah. So I'll try and answer that one quickly because it's quite a long answer really. But two things I'm going to recommend there. One is that you build up a kind of a CV database. So rather than trying to write a CV, often what I will suggest with my clients is to say, just think of any experience in your past which looks like an achievement, something where you added value, you over-delivered, you did something creative or new. Just write them all down. Doesn't matter when they happened. So you build up this kind of database, and then you decide from that, what is the stuff that I really want to feature on page one? And that may not make sense to you because you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, page one is going to have just my most recent 2 jobs. Well, it doesn't have to do that. You can write a short profile and have some bullet points underneath it. You can list a section of key achievements or key areas of experience. If you want somebody to notice something, it needs to be on the first half of page one, and you need to filter. So you will end up with maybe sometimes 40 or 50 or even more pieces of information. I mean, I often say that the average CV contains about 150 items of information, but if somebody recommends you, they'll say 3 things. So in a way, you've got to do that filtering to say, okay, of this body of evidence, what do I want to put at the top end of my CV and the front screen of a LinkedIn profile? But come back to the second half of the question, thank you, Lee, is if you're going to match against the job description, then you need to analyze the job and work out what the top 6 requirements are and feature those in a cover email or cover letter. So here's my CV. In relation to the job, which I'm really interested in, you might like to look at the following pieces of evidence and use different language to your CV, but that's the moment. If you convince somebody you're a good match to the top 6 items in a job, you are very, very close to being shortlisted.
And then I suppose after you're in the interview, you can do the talking yourself. So that makes it easier as well. The other half of Lee's question was actually if you have any specific page recommendations for the book. So just to put you on the spot there.
What, around CVs?
Well, yes.
Already.
Anything. So.
Well, yeah, I never remember page references in my own books, but I will say, don't read it like a novel. Dip in and out, look at the things that are immediately useful to you. In the new edition of How to Get a Job You Love, there's a 4-hour job search. There's CV material at the back end of the book. There's information, interviews are covered in one particular chapter if you're looking for a script. So right at the beginning of the book, there's a section that says how to use this book, and it summarizes all of the content, all of the sections. Dip into that and go to the chapter which is most useful to you right now.
That's definitely a good summary of the book. So going back to some of the questions that we got before, do you have any advice for recent entrants to the job market, like this summer's graduates who definitely entering at a difficult time?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I've just earlier this week made 3 videos for my old university and to help people in exactly that position. The most important thing really is to think about evidence that is more likely to grab an employer's attention. The problem with a lot of recent graduate CVs is that they do tend to major their most recent and significant experience, which is study. So they tend to say a lot about what they've done. Now, if you translate that into an employer's mindset, yes, they want to know you've got a good degree. They're interested to know roughly what you studied, particularly if there's any content which relates to the world of work. And they might be interested to know why you chose it. How does it relate to your career story? But after that, their appetite for information around that really disappears fast. So then don't list your A levels and your GCSEs. Go straight into your work experience or anything which looks like work, which could be researching, communicating, team working in a student context. It could be holiday working. It could be volunteering. It could be mentoring somebody else. Anything which looks like work, that's the stuff that you major on, and don't hide it away on page 2.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely going back to the CV being so important. And so this is a question that's come in from Jilly. What do you think of functional CVs for people who are making a big career change? So really trying to shift that career story.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. That's a good question. I did cover this in some depth in my CV book because we did some research there with organizations, and I've spent a lot of time working with external recruiters. And the strange thing about a functional CV, well, let's say what it is to start with, really, because not everyone will recognize the term. A functional CV, rather than listing your job history, job after job, starting with your most recent role, what it tends to do is to have bullet points in blocks relating to particular skills. So the first functional group might be organizational skills or leadership skills or communication skills, and then the evidence comes under that. Now, the problem with that is on paper, as a theory, it's a great idea because it takes people's attention away from your work history. Sadly, in my experience, employers hate them and recruitment consultants hate them. Apart from that, they're perfect. So, and also they can be screened out in the early stages of a process if you send one into a job board, because unfortunately, what organizations are looking for is a clear evidence of where you've worked, what role titles you've held, what your story is. But the CV format I'm talking about today is a nice hybrid, which helps with that. So rather, before you get into that, what you've done is to grab the reader's attention, done the handover bit, as if you were in the room saying, before you hear my work history, read this. That's the profile. Maybe some key bullet points which really bring out your major work-related strengths, and then you have your work history, which satisfies the needs of most organizations to find that very quickly.
Yeah, it's they've got the information they expect, but you can also give them the information you want to give them as well, which is definitely important. So Justin's asked a question around cover letters and whether or not you think that companies see them as old-fashioned or not, because I think there's a bit of a mixture of opinions there.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I think there is a mixture of opinions. But when we say cover letter, of course, often these days what we mean is a cover email. And the great thing about, but sometimes, don't let me mislead you all. Sometimes a good old-fashioned CV printed on nice paper, sent with a covering letter, actually gets people's attention. So there are rules and rules that we subvert all the time. But generally speaking, if you can add some extra information, do so. Now, there are some processes which essentially say upload your CV to this website. Don't send a covering letter. Well, you comply with that, obviously, just the same way as if you have to fill in an application form. But if you can, the great advantage of it is what you're doing is grabbing the reader's attention immediately, assuring somebody that you can cover the basic elements. So as I said earlier, 6 top things that the organization is looking for, put 6 bullet points in your cover letter, and that's it. Don't try and sell yourself any further. The whole letter should not be longer than 1 page. In fact, it should be shorter than a whole page of A4. But that's all you're doing, is you're saying, I'm drawing your attention to the fact I can do this job. And then when somebody reads your CV, what they're doing is looking for confirmation of a decision that they have already made.
sort of guiding them by the hand and taking them that way. And I suppose this is almost a reverse of that question, because what Mike asks, what approach would you recommend to following up an application when you're not hearing anything from the recruiter? How can you kind of, I guess, remind them of the points that you've actually put in the CV and the cover letter if you're not hearing from them?
Thanks, Mike. It's something we hear a lot, because one of the features of today's marketplace is that organizations are uncertain. So sometimes it means that jobs get advertised or recruitment processes are put on hold. Sometimes it means that busy executives get distracted and are not able to sign off at a certain stage of the process. Never assume that you've been rejected. It's worth a polite follow-up. If you heard nothing at all and you're pitching directly to an organization, with job boards, it's different. The rules of the game with job boards is that you hardly ever hear anything in response. But if you're applying directly to an organization, to a named person, then first of all, think about relationship building in the first place. Is there somebody you can ring before you apply? Not to lobby, not to ask for special favors, but maybe to ask a couple of intelligent questions about the job so that you are noticed. And then if you've applied and you haven't heard anything, well, what's the worst that can happen if you send a gentle reminder to say, I hope you got the application. Maybe something you didn't put in the first time, maybe a little bit of extra messaging that you want to put in. Why not? The worst that can happen is you get ignored again. Well, that's going to happen. So it's not rude. It's not over assertive. It's not pushy, unless you're saying, why haven't you replied to me? This is dreadful behavior. If you start down that game, you're going to go nowhere.
Yeah, as you said, sometimes people are busy and they just need that extra little nudge. So might as well give it to them. So do you have any tips for staying resilient and positive when a job search is prolonged or is met with silence? So that broader thing, not just following up, but what can you do?
I really hear that, because everybody starts, no matter where people start in the process, whether they've just been made redundant or they're looking for a job for the first time, or they've been out of the market for some time and they're trying to get back in, they tend to start from a position of optimism. They tend to think the world's my oyster, I've got some good stuff to talk about, let's just get on with it. And of course, particularly if you fire off random applications and to apply for jobs that you know nothing about, you are going to hear radio silence. And the problem with silence is job seekers fill it with their own noise. They say, well, look, that's evidence that I'm too old, or I'm underqualified, or I haven't got a degree, so therefore that gets in the way. It's evidence of nothing. It's evidence of the fact that organizations often don't respond. So that's what happens. Confidence can crash fairly quickly. It is a kind of resilience, because resilience is about bouncing back in the face of pressure. So the two things I know that work well, one is to always include in your diet conversations with positive, energized people. Even somebody that's just made an interesting career change. They may have moved into a career that you're not interested in, but talk to them anyway, because that you will pick up something from their attitude and their energy and their strategy. And the second is to recruit 2 positive-minded friends and meet with them regularly. Even if you can't meet in real circumstances, have a glass of wine over Zoom, but find people who are positive-minded. So they remind you what you're good at. They help you overcome barriers. They say, okay, well, we're going to look next. They say, well, never mind that rejection letter. You're going to get a lot of those. So what are you going to do tomorrow? How are you going to get back on the horse? We really need those people. And because the human brain is so good at finding negative information and latching onto it, we have to artificially put something on the positive side of the scales. And it usually means other people who are actually just good at elevating our confidence levels. And that really matters, because if you get anywhere near a job interview, your energy levels are very visible, very audible. People are aware how committed and energized you are.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It's important to have someone that you're accountable to. If you don't have sort of structure provided by a job or something like that, that's how you can keep going. And then I know that there's some sort of careers advisors on the call as well. So kind of flipping that question slightly, someone sent this in advance. How can we give people hope and sustain hope and positivity in these difficult times? So for those job searchers in your life.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I sometimes say to clients I work with is I say even some of the best salespeople on the planet will tell you that they have to hear 3 people say no before they get a yes. So 75% of their responses are people saying no. And those are the best people. Those are the best salespeople. So people like you and I are just doing average stuff. We're going to hear no even more than that. So you need to prepare in advance how you're going to deal with the word no. And that's about getting support group, getting 2 other people in your corner. And I really literally mean a support trio, not one-on-one, but meet together as a trio, because there's nothing as powerful as listening to 2 people talk to you and support you and encourage you and make you feel better about yourself. It is one of the most supportive things that I've ever come across. It's something I recommend to all of my clients because it works. But generally, you know, and if you find I mean, it's sort of planning for rejection, really. You know that you're going to have to kiss a lot of frogs, as they say. You know you're going to have to hear the word no. You know you're going to hear radio silence. And so it's good to think, well, how am I going to respond to that and not make decisions? You know, if you're in the down cycle, if somebody that you think would automatically return your call and be helpful to you, somebody's too busy to talk to you, we go into a down cycle. Don't make a decision in the down cycle. If you're beating yourself up, that's the worst day to rewrite your CV or change your job search strategy.
Yeah, I think it's good to plan for those negative sides as well as the positive sides, because then you're prepared for them. As you said, they are inevitable in many ways. And so we've got 2 more questions that have come in. And I think this question links well to what you've just said. If you're considering changing career altogether, how can you be sure not to jump into something too quickly and not weigh up all the other options? So yeah, the difference between balancing further research and taking the plunge, and maybe sort of not giving up too quickly if you're on that down.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Helen, for that question. It's something I hear a lot. You know, how will I know if I like it? Well, the obvious answer to that is if you research things the right way, if you talk to people about what the real experience of work is like, not the glamorous version of work that organizations want to project, but the real experience of work. If you find out what it's like to perform particular roles, then you do start to filter in a very positive and clear way, and you start to boil it down to acceptable alternatives. One of the great myths really is that there is one perfect role for us out there. And I don't believe that's true for most people. I think what we actually learn to do is to organize and find a healthy mix. So a job which satisfies us for, 3.5 days a week out of 5. That's enough. If you're using your motivated skills, if you're matched to the role, if you're doing something interesting, if you have purposeful outcomes for the majority of your working week, then that work will work for you. And there comes a point where you are going to have to become a little bit more focused. And good enough is a good phrase, I think. Focus on something which is good enough, particularly at a time like this, because if you put something good enough on your CV for the next 2 years, and in 2 years' time, you can tell the story that says, I took it because I learned from it, I knew it would stretch me, it was a great stepping stone, then that's probably okay. So perfection is a dangerous thing, because it stops people looking and stops people exploring and stops people getting focused on the kind of role that they'd really like to do.
And I think you're right that it's good to remember that a career story is also a journey, always moving ahead. So it's never going to be static as in perfection. And so I think this is a good question to end on. What are some ideas to find the hiring manager of a company job post to connect with them, and tips to start that conversation with them? Because I think so much of your advice today has been about having those conversations and reaching out beyond the kind of sort of initial thing and having real connections.
I was always saying, think about why you're approaching that person, because if you're approaching that person because you want to know more about the organization and how it recruits and the kind of people who work there and what's going on in that sector, the hiring manager may not be the person to do it, because the hiring managers are much more attuned to candidate approaches, and they're much more likely to turn it into a job search conversation, like by simply saying, just send me your CV. I haven't got time to talk to you, send me a CV. So that's the first question. Is the hiring manager the person you really want to talk to if you are gathering information and exploring? However, if you know there's an organization you'd really like to work with, research it, talk to people around it, people who know it, and then if you think, how do I get close to this organization? One of the tools available to you is a direct pitch, a short email to that hiring manager, to a named person. And my recommendation actually is that you don't send a CV. The CV will get used in the process, but a short email that says, I'm really interested in what you do. I know that this is the kind of role that you regularly advertise for, or these are the kind of problems you're trying to solve as an organization. These are 3 or 4 things from my past you might be interested in. Can we talk? Because somebody will read that and act upon it. If you attach the CV, it goes into the category of, here's a complicated document and I'll read it later. So if you want a response, you want a conversation, that's the way to approach a hiring manager. Doesn't work every time, but then nothing works every time. You've got to try all of these things.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you have just an attached CV, it seems more speculative. Whereas if you're controlling that message, you can pick out exactly which ones you want to highlight. So you can kind of keep it in your control. Unfortunately, we're sort of coming into the end here, but it would be really great if people leave feedback in the chat. So just to hear what you've enjoyed and sort of any other things that you'd like to say. And otherwise, thank you very much, John. I've had a really good time, and it looks like people are already saying how useful they found it. And yeah, we're delighted to now have the 11th edition of the book out. So I've got my copy here.
There it is.
Yeah, I definitely think that there are so many positive stories in your book about the different ways that you can find the job you love, because obviously there are lots of different routes that some people won't feel comfortable taking initially, and I think there are lots of different explorations on building confidence in sending something which isn't just the CV into the ether on a job application, and really about connecting with people. I know from my own experience that I've always had time when people have emailed me to ask what we do at the press and what kind of avenues teams have experienced in terms of finding their jobs within the role. And I think for publishing, for example, editorial often seems like the obvious one because it's about words and people think, oh, I like reading books, but actually there are so many different roles within this one industry that most people don't even know about. And so I think everything that you say is exactly spot on in terms of being able to explore, and people will always find time for that. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all who have been sharing your feedback in the chat function. This has been recorded. So if you want to replay it on repeat during your searches, then you'll certainly have that option. Thanks again, John.
Thank you.